All right, so now for Onyx Palm. Now, just like with broadleaf and conifer, UI is the same. So height, shading, what part of the tree is being displayed. So you can see that palm has only 4 different sections. So we have the trunk, and if we just go back, we have the trunk, the sort of top of the trunk, the stems, and then the leaves that grow off of those. Um, our shading, cutting off branches, moving and zooming, our helix, our wind properties. And so as you can see in here, go to wind. If I then, let's say, increase the wind a bit, you can totally see the wind blowing on those leaves. And of course, you can control for the trunk, stem, and the leaflets how they react to the wind. And so you have control in here over their elasticity. So if I make that a lot stronger, you can see that as I start playing inside here with these settings, we can start getting different results. So here I'm just going to go in, and now you can see the stems are really reacting to the wind, so I can just lower that down a little bit. So you can see it gets blown, and then maybe not have 79-mile-an-hour winds. So basic wind parameters and wind controls, just like with broadleaf and with conifer. But to point out something with Onyx Palm is that if we go to export, we can export sequences. And so in here, if I do my count, this default palm tree is only 10,000 polys. You can see the leaves are set to be polyline. We can see in here that we have sequence export, and importantly, fixed segments, which you would want to turn on for sequence export for exporting a sequence of OBJs that you can import into Maya using that blend shape based import script that I mentioned to you. And then for the leaflets and for the trunk, we don't have complex controls for the leaves like with the broadleaf. Basically, you can control for the trunk, does it show the molding or not? So this is going to be a simple trunk with no molding versus showing the molding. And then for the leaves, are they just going to be little squares, or meaning, are they going to be cards? Or the default will be that they'll actually export with the shape that you see in Onyx. So this more complex leaf shape, if you see that, that's what you're going to get. And so, which is related to, if we go over to the attribute area, you can see a lot fewer options than when we were dealing with broadleaf, which just makes it even easier to learn. But obviously we have our trunk, we have our stems, and so as opposed to having, the bough and B1, B2, B3 twigs and stems, we just have stems. So it simplifies our life a little bit inside here. And then for leaves, obviously we have angle, length, curving, density, and then under leaf type, we have these different types of leaf shapes, and you can control the shape of that upon export. So if you want Onyx to export the leaf shapes that you actually see inside here, based on these different varieties of palm leaves, so if that's what you do want it to export, then under your save model as OBJ options, just use the complex leaf shape. And there you go. So there is, as with the other programs, a big and great library of palm trees. And so if we go to load parameters, we can see we have palm and then our aquatic and fantasy. So obviously we have a bit of, well, not a lot of stuff in here under aquatic, some fantastic palms, which, not so useful. But in the regular palm library, there's a lot of great stuff. And so the cool thing with palms, which is unique as opposed to broadleaf trees or pine trees, aside from the fact that we have these fronds, is the fact that it actually models the trunk with appropriate geometry. Because as a palm tree grows, and so let's go in here and grab a tree that has, let's say, what I'm talking about. Okay, and go into shaded mode. You can see the complexity of the trunk. And so, because basically as these palm fronds grow and as the tree grows, they grow out and they eventually die and break off or are cut off. And so what's left behind are sort of the stumps of all of the branches or stems that have grown in the past. And so with onyx, you can see that you can actually get a geometry-based trunk. And so for hero trees or hero palm trees, that's a pretty cool feature that is included. And so in here, if we go through the library a little bit more, and we look for generic palm trees, so you can see here we have Cocos nucifera, and so a generic coconut-bearing palm tree. And so, you know, the kind you would sort of see in a typical vacation photo of a beach in Hawaii, so which is called beach. So if I open this guy up, we can see it's hanging down quite a bit, but that's going to be relatively easy to control. And so you can see in here you have control for the angle of this tree. So if I go and make some adjustments in here, there we go. Under trunk curving, now it's not curving down quite so much. And so I can adjust the curving at the top of the tree, the middle of the tree. So here I have it going straight up, curving to the right, and the top of the tree going up. Or I could go and get this to be a little bit more straight, a little less curve there. So the basic changes you might want to make with this tree, obviously. And so just like, you know, we kind of encountered with onyx conifer, there's not a lot to say inside here because once you've used one, they're also similar. So really in here, controlling the length of your stems and twists and curving, that's going to be all to your personal preference. But what I highly recommend, if you're building a library of palm trees, just go through and export a whole bunch of these, remembering that you can go and randomize the seed value. And so if I just go in and randomize some seed values in here, you can see how like the positioning of all of those stems inside there, all of the fronds, is going to get randomized. So as you go through this library, it's just a matter of loading them up, randomizing some seed values, and exporting your little library of palm trees. So I've done that already, and so we're going to jump over to Maya in a second, but just showing you a couple different ones. So here we can see that we have the green fronds as well as some dead fronds underneath that are hanging down and dry. And just really, really nice, cool shape. So again, referring back to the PaintFX tree DVD, where we also talked about how to make palm trees, while we could make some okay looking palm trees for, you know, mid to background palms, and if you only have PaintFX, you'd have to live with it. But really, the quality of the palm trees that are coming out of onyx are really, really, really nice looking. So now that we've taken a brief look at onyx, not much more to say. We can see this is a big one. This one is 10 meters tall, so about 20 some odd feet. And of course, just our basic export options. So if I'm just exporting a regular tree, this guy's 145,000 polys. The leaves are set to polyline. And yeah, so that's onyx palm. Not much more to say. It's cool. It's easy. There you go. So in regards to Maya, let's jump over there. So what I have open in this scene is I just exported some trees from onyx and imported them into Maya and assigned shaders with textures for the leaves, and that's pretty much that. So physical sun and sky, single directional light, final gather, and MIA materials. So I also have some other renders of these palm trees, and so what we're looking at is I instanced these palm trees, obviously, to create a whole bunch of them. And I also am using 3D depth of field, just using a lens blur with the bokeh depth of field node with a bokeh texture assigned to it, which is creating this chromatic aberration effect. And I think they look pretty cool. So while I kind of like my thing with conifer and pine trees, I haven't made like some big cool scene with palm trees yet. So this is about as much as I've done with palm trees in regards to creating a scene that's just about palms. I've used palms quite a bit. I've worked on a couple architectural projects where we needed palm trees, and I used onyx palm to create them, but I can't show any of those renders, unfortunately. So, but with this, I can see that in the end, just with some simple instancing and depth of field and physical sun and sky, that it's looking kind of cool. So what's going on in the scene as far as shaders? Well, if I open up Hypershade, then you can see how simple the scene is. And so first off, I've got my typical trunk shader setup. So a color map that's getting turned into grayscale for bump and reflection color. For my trunk, we can see that I've got a little bit of roughness, glossiness of 0.25, and very relatively low setting for the 90-degree reflection, so it's not a highly reflective trunk, and that actually could be even lowered down a little bit. And then I've got in here, let's see, select objects with material. So here in my next scene where I instance them, I actually made a better shader for the dead leaves. Here I'm just putting a solid color. Those obviously need a texture on them. But what I did do in here is obviously texture the leaves. And so I'm texturing them with a 3x3 grid. And so just like we did with broadleaf trees, it's highly recommended to create some variation across the leaves on your palm trees. And so the palm fronds that I have inside here, if we just go and zoom in on them, that's not what I wanted. Let's go and zoom in on those guys. So we can see that the leaves as exported from Onyx are exported where the shape of the leaf is in the actual geometry. And so what this means is I don't need to worry about cutout opacity. I could, like I already mentioned, have Onyx export the leaves so that they're cards and they're square so that I do use cutout opacity, but this makes my life a hell of a lot easier. So obviously the polygon count on the leaves goes up a little bit, but I'm not really bothered by that. So we can see also with the tree, as far as the polygon count, in the sense that it has some detail on the edge of it. So you could obviously simplify that trunk out and not have it if you just wanted to do all of it via texture just to save some polys, because clearly the trunk is adding up to about 7,000 polys inside there. But as you can tell by now, to me that's not a lot. So in here, since they have that shape, I don't need to go in and worry about a cutout opacity. So what worked out really well for me was to basically use my shader that I use for grass on my palm fronds. And so I have this texture that I made where I just scanned some, not blades of grass, just because those are, too small to get enough resolution for them, but I actually have a spider plant. There's some spider plants in front of my house that kind of look like a scaled up version of grass, and I took some of those and scanned those. And so I'll show you real quick what that scan looks like in Photoshop. And so I'm just going to go and just jump to Photoshop real quick. And in here you can see if I just open these two. So my scanner is roughly 8x10, so it gives you an idea of the length of these leaves that I grabbed. And so these, obviously trying to, I actually do have a couple palm trees in front of my house too, but I don't have a ladder to go and cut down some big old palm frond leaves and whatever. You get the point. So it's a matter of trying to find something that's similar. And so this on a scaled down version is kind of similar enough to what the leaf on a palm tree looks like that I could basically use these to create my 3x3 texture. And so we can see that I end up creating this. So they look kind of weird and stretched out because obviously the UVs on a leaf, whether it's for grass or a palm frond, are long and thin, but the UVs are square. And so I basically take these long, thin scans and stretch them out horizontally so that they fill a square. And so it gives me a texture that looks blurry, but this is going to be mapped onto something that is thin. So it gets, sort of scaled back down to be appropriate. And so you can see that I'm just doing something where I've got, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different, I really only have 6 different textures in here, because if you look here, I only scanned 7 of them. And so I'm just repeating, this one is getting repeated here, and this one's getting repeated here, and this one's getting repeated here. So I'm not getting 9 different variations, I'm actually getting 6, but it's still randomly placing them. So, obviously things would look even better if I took the time to scan some more and fill these bottom 3. But creating this texture is super, super easy and goes fast. So, but since I'm using this 3x3 on my leaves in Maya, then clearly if I select my leaves and I go to the UV texture editor, you'll see in here that I've put them into a 3x3 tile. It looks really weird just because not all of the leaves have the exact same polygon count or polygon layout. So it looks like there's overlap, but it's not. So if I go and grab a single leaf, you can see how its UVs are structured inside here. So, and if I go grab another one, you can see where it is. So I'm just grabbing different leaves, and we can see that they are in a 3x3 grid. So as mentioned, I use my DJX script. And so the DJX script works great for any leaf object that I've given it so far. And so basically after I import a tree from Onyx Palm, step 1 is, group them together. Step 2 is make sure that visible and reflections and visible and refractions is on. And then step 3 is to select the leaf object and simply execute the script with the number 3 in there, so I get a 3x3 grid. So I did that for all of the leaves on all of these poly objects. And there you go. And so basically that gives me the ability to have this shader. And so if we go back to the shader for a second, we can see that I've got this as a color map that's also being used as bump. It's being gamma corrected. And I can see that that map is also gamma corrected and being multiplied, going into translucency color. And then we can see glossiness 0.3. I have a little bit of roughness on them just because palm fronds, I did take the time to look at a couple, pictures or look at the palm fronds that I have in front of my house, and they're pretty rough. They're not nearly as smooth as a regular leaf or a blade of grass. So I just introduced a little bit of roughness in there. And translucency, ambient occlusion. Of course, since they have no thickness, under advanced refraction, I have thin walled on, and of course, under reflection, I have skip reflection on inside off. So those are my settings. And then BRDF 0.1 and 1 because they're reflective at glancing angles. So if we jump out here, I have a couple quick times that I showed you earlier. And so if I play this one, we can see it's just a simple camera move, just so I can evaluate how my shader is looking. So again, just basically using the same shader I use for grass on my palm fronds. So getting sort of, the variation where I can see some of them are yellowish and greenish and yellowish at the tips. Obviously the reflectivity, the 0 degree reflectivity is important in here. Maybe they're a little bit glossy, so I could potentially lower the glossiness down a little bit and increase the roughness a little bit. But I think that they're selling the point of being palm trees pretty effectively. And then the other guy that's in here is just a static camera where I'm rotating the directional light. So just like I mentioned with Conifer earlier, that sometimes I'll render out QuickTimes with the directional light moving around just to evaluate the shader. And so this allows me to see the palm trees front lit and also allows me to see them backlit. And so as I scrub through here, I can kind of evaluate, what's going on with my 0 degree and 90 degree reflection values. Evaluate, what's going on with the shader on my bark for the tree trunk. And it looks pretty cool. So really, really simple, you know. And for the shader that's on the bark, I just said bark, and there's a dog barking outside. That confused my brain. So if I go to the trunk, then I just have a generic pine tree texture. And so this is, I think, something I grabbed from CG Textures. So if I go back to Photoshop and go to Open and go to Maps and go to Bark. So I have a bunch of different bark textures in here. And if I scroll down to the bottom, I know that I have some pine tree bark, or rather palm tree bark. So you can see this is from a palm tree. Although I kind of like this one, but this one is not really tileable. And so you can see that the top of it's all dark and the bottom isn't. So I just made a version of it where I cleaned up the top to make it tileable. So you can see this is the one I downloaded online. And then this one you can see I renamed it to Tile, just so that I have something that can tile vertically as well as horizontally. So I did make a tweak to this texture, and there's obviously lots of different types of bark for palm trees, but I'm just using this generic one that's being repeated once and twice vertically. And for the renders that I showed you, specifically this one, it works fine. So it's not necessarily the right kind of bark for this kind of palm tree, and that's just a matter of how anal you want to be as far as having things being correct. But it's so easy to just look at some photos on Google and find the bark texture in your library that is appropriate to that kind of tree. But in here, since the geometry of the tree also, you know, has breakup to it, because it has all the sort of cut or broken remainders of the stems that have fallen off, you know, we get some interesting looking breakup inside the texture as well. So that's the basics of palm trees. In regards to this scene file, I can open that up real quick. So that's going to be Onyx Palm. Let's go here, File, Project, Onyx, Open. And Palm, let's go to the last one, 05. All right, so this is the scene that I rendered all those images that have the depth of field in them. And so if I rewind to frame 1, you can see that as I go to frame 3, frame 4, frame 5, all I did was save keyframes on my camera at a bunch of different positions and then batch rendered the animation to get a bunch of stills. So that's something I do a lot too when I want a bunch of different views of a scene. And, you know, if the scene takes 10 minutes to render, I don't want to sit and stare at my render for 10 minutes and then move the camera and render again. So that's something we all do way too much in 3D. But a nice way to avoid that is just keyframe your camera for all these different views you want, just to check things out, and then launch it when you go to bed and wake up and have a bunch of different stills. So in here, if I look at the scene from another point of view, okay, then we have 41 million polygons in here. Not that bad, actually. Yeah, okay. So you can see that I've extended it out pretty far down. So on my particle object, I've got 600 palm trees in here, and all starting with a total of 8 different palm trees. It says 7, but remember with the index, with the object index, it starts at ID 0. So I have 8 different palm trees that are being randomly placed on my particles that are being emitted off of this little plane that's right there. And so in here you can see that I can move around and have a cool start point of a beach scene, because obviously at this point it's just a matter of using the sculpt geometry tool and modeling a little beach and putting some hills in the background, and, you know, creating a little scene like that wouldn't be that complicated. But I just had time to sort of put this together real quick. So I've got my different trees, keyframe my camera in different positions, and from a shader perspective, you can see the outliner is practically empty. So we have, again, my same shader on the leaves, same shader on the trunks, and it looks like I was lazy and I didn't, that's on the ground. So yeah, I still have that dumb shader on the dead leaves. And so don't really notice in the renders because if we go in the render view window, the main thing is that the value in these is correct. So like here we don't see any of the dead leaves. Here we don't. Here we don't. Or here. So I think that's why I didn't notice that I didn't apply a texture to it. So, but what I would assign to that is I also have for my grass, if I go to maps, leaf scans, grass, is I've got this guy. So meaning it's like a brown version of the leaf texture that I can map onto dead stuff. So it's a little yellow, so I could always go and color correct it and make it a little bit brown and make it a little bit darker, or specifically maybe adjust levels on it to keep the contrast up on these. So maybe I'd want, you know, a lot of contrast so we can read detail on them, although they wouldn't be that saturated, so maybe I'd lower the saturation down. So I think for the dead fronds, something like that would probably work pretty well. So I've got my leafy fronds that are green, and this one for the dead ones. Let's go back to Maya. But in here I just used a solid color. So again, I do this thing where I'm gamma correcting, or adding a gamma node, and I'm a dork. This one should be at 0.454, 0.454 in here. And so then I would get that color. Since I didn't gamma correct it, that means that that color would be brighter in the render. So I didn't fix it because I didn't notice, because on all those renders that I did, that I showed you, it's just the dead fronds are not that visible. But I think hopefully you get the idea. So it's kind of neat looking seeing all these palm trees, I must say. And again, just the geometry out of Onyx for palms are so cool looking. So you could, you know, get close to this with Paint Effects, but again, it's like, since I have Onyx, why bother? Except for animation. Obviously, if I need something with a lot of wind blowing through the leaves and palm trees, exporting the OBJs from Onyx is, you know, laborious. So maybe if I was in a hurry, I would do it with Paint Effects, just so I could have the animation be done directly in Maya. But yeah. And then the only other thing that's in this scene, if I go to my camera, is I did mention that I have my camera that I'm rendering with, which I think is this camera. Yeah. I'm rendering with Persp 1, which is this guy. So I can see that's the one that has all the keyframes on it. So it's got, obviously it's connected to the physical sky and the exposure photographic node, but you can see I also mapped a lens bokeh node for the depth of field. And so if you're not sure where that goes on your camera, so you want to go to Mental Ray, and then go to Lens Shaders, and then just hit Create. And then when you click Create, go to Mental Ray Lenses, and just click on MIA Lens Bokeh. That's all I did. And then automatically you get depth of field. And then on the Lens Bokeh node, there's an on-off parameter. It adds a lot to render time. That's why you've seen me using a Z-depth pass to add depth of field in post, because that's so much more interactive. But if I've got the time and I'm just rendering stills, the depth of field, 3D depth of field with Mental Ray does look really neat. But this is your on-off. Your plane is basically the distance from the camera that will be in focus. So this acts wonky. And so like it would be nice if this was not wonky, but it is. So sometimes I have to do a few test renders to find the right plane number. In some scenes this works perfectly, where the distance from the camera in centimeters or units to the object I want to be in focus is the number I can put in there. But in some scenes I've found that doesn't quite work right. Radius is the amount of depth of field you have. And so if you raise that number really high, you're going to get a very, very shallow depth of field, meaning a lot of blur, or you can lower it down and get less. Samples obviously is, if you have this really low, your depth of field is going to look really noisy and grainy. So you need to raise that up for your final render. And then we have bias, blade count, and blade angle. And so your blade count, if you think of the aperture of a camera, it has blades that open and close. And so the bokeh node creates the highlights as they go out of focus will bloom to take on the shape of the aperture. just like a real camera. Just think of out of focus Christmas lights. So you can control in here the number of blades, and you can rotate the blade as well. And then bias, I forget what that does. So I don't want to guess. I'm blanking on what the bias does. I don't really play with it that much. That's why I can't remember. And then use bokeh. It's going to give you blooming highlights regardless, but if you turn on use bokeh, you can specify a texture. And I am using a texture in here. And so, which is this guy. And so what that looks like, go into Photoshop, and I go to maps, and that's this guy. It's tiny, doesn't need to be really big, but basically this gives you a chromatic aberration effect. And so if you have that mapped to your image on your bokeh, then in your render, you get this chromatic aberration effect. So you can see how like the colors are kind of shifting in areas that are out of focus. So you've seen me do that a bit in After Effects using Magic Bullet. But the effect that you get by doing it in 3D is a lot cooler looking. It just takes a while to render. And so these render times are not accurate because that's just from the last render I actually did in Maya, which was this. So that took 57 seconds. These, I could tell you how long they took to render. Onyx Palm 05, those are those renders. So details, almost an hour per frame. So each of these took almost an hour to render. And it's really the depth of field that's causing that. Otherwise, they would probably render, you know, in under 5 minutes. So seriously, like adding the depth of field makes it take 10 times longer to render, especially if you want the sampling to be good so you don't have grain and it's clean. So 3D depth of field, really neat looking. Has a really nice photographic look to it, but it's just a little expensive for animation. For stills, it's fine, but I still, in the end, am usually satisfied with doing it in post, because usually when I add depth of field, I'm adding a very low blur amount, so I'm just adding a subtle amount of depth of field. When you want to add a very strong amount of depth of field, like I have in here, where this near ground palm frond is really out of focus, the look that you get by doing it in 3D is a lot cooler, because since it's 3D, it really knows what's behind this frond as it's blurring it out of focus, because it's 3D. After Effects with a Z-depth file doesn't really know what's behind this thing as it blurs it, and so the effect you get looks a little artificial. So when you want, you know, very, very large amounts of depth of field with a lot of blur, that's when I would recommend using 3D depth of field. But anyway, that's me tangenting and talking about depth of field when we're supposed to be talking about palm trees, but it's useful information, I hope. So yeah, so that's pretty much all I have to say about palm trees, really. Use Onyx because it's cool and it creates amazing palm trees. And as you've seen, like we did with this beach palm, so easy to just adjust the parameters to get a little different amount of bend in it, or change the spacing of your leaves, spacing of the stems, and so forth. So, and all of the settings are exactly the same for exporting an OBJ sequence, and the process is the same, just like we did at the beginning of the DVD, to be able to import that sequence into Maya. So, cool. So now that we've talked about Onyx Palm, and talked about the shaders for it, and seen some renders, I guess it's time to move on from palm trees. And the next thing we're going to talk about is going to be bamboo. So Onyx Bamboo, as you can expect, is also relatively straightforward. For that, I did build a more finished scene. That's really, really simple, but looks kind of neat, I think. So let's move on to Onyx Bamboo.